So this demo today, I'm going to be using what we call AMAB. It's a cell culture process, but a lot of our customers are cell and gene therapy. I'm more familiar with cell culture processes. I spend a lot more time with them. But the concepts are the same, whether it's small molecule, large molecule, cell and gene therapy, medical device. It's really, as long as you have batch-oriented processes, that it really fits well. So I'll be focusing on AMAP. So this is an example of one site or one product under one site, but as you can see, this can be used to manage many products under many sites. And the general end user who does not have an admin role, when they log in, they would only see those products that they've been given access to. They wouldn't even be aware of other products that might exist in the system or sites that they're manufactured at even. So we'll be focusing on AMAB. And just one thing I want to point out is, when a product is added to the system, and we don't really care if it's manufactured at one site or multiple sites. Some of these products, different parts take place at different sites, and that's all one licensed product. But if we look at this AMAB product, when I go in here, when this product was created, it was we added the licensed product under the site Cambridge. I have markets here. May not be so applicable in your situation, but this is true for some products that are released in different markets, and they have different specifications depending on the market. And then sub-products too. That comes under one product definition. They could have different specification or target control limits. But what you'll notice here is we have reference URLs, attachments, and these are available throughout the system to provide that extra knowledge that's easily lost about the process. And there's various places where you can add notes along the way as well. As I mentioned, this is based on this AMAB product that came out of the CPV case study by the BPOG group, Bio Operations Group. It's like a 100-page case study. Gives a lot of great detail on how to create a CPV program. So that's a URL. There's some description here, and then we have PDF. So I have a flow chart of the process here. Here's my upstream flow chart. And then when we get into the process definition, each one of these steps or unit operations could be blown out into additional flow charts that get into more detail in each of those. Any questions on that so far?
No, I'm familiar with the BPOG work, so this makes sense to me.
Oh, great. Very good. So going back to the home page, when one logs in, we have a My Charts section, a My Alerts section, and some general announcements and corporate information there. When I look at My Charts, here's some of the favorites that I tagged in the analytics module. And by the way, of course, Mark talked about the three modules: limits, which consists of specification limits and target control limits. They're versioned separately, maybe by different people or groups, so we have different roles for those. Then we have the batch data entry, and then the analytics, which marries them together and produces charts like this. And then the process definition is really the foundation for all three of those modules, ties everything together. So that provides a contextual view of all of your process steps and parameters. We'll get into in a little bit. But just at a high level, we have some favorite charts here. Here's an example of a segmented chart. Starting with a certain batch here, a new target control limit came into effect, so it created another segment to this chart. If I want to get into any details in any of these, or get into the analytics where I can kind of change the configuration settings, I go in here. That takes me to the analytics module. Right now, we have the individual control charts or individual to movement range and X bar and R, X bar and S, process capability, normality plot, and continuous line plot. So we're looking at cell growth, typically cell expansion, where we want to plot cell concentrations versus time, for example. And I can go through those all in a bit, but this was the initial focus on process monitoring or CPV. And of course, as people get their hands on this, they want more and more capabilities, and then we're striving to put those in as quickly as possible to do more ad hoc investigational things there. But so here's the chart, and what really makes this unique, of course, from having a tool like SAS Jump or Minitab is the way it just the UI and the workflow and the way it automatically marries up these target control limits and specification limits. The way we have drill down capability here, so I can drill down this point, and there's comments associated with that. It could be marked as an outlier, and this would show up in any tool within the product people look at, so that's an option there. Here's some general information. Of course, everything's audited, and this is one thing, of course, that's unique from Jump and Minitab is it's built to be validatable, 21 CFR compliant, so it has all the auditing and so forth. So if I click on the batch metadata, each batch when it's created for unit operation consists of the batch ID and the batch date. The batch itself could have comments associated with it and an outlier status set to yes or no. This happens to be for 50 mg per mil auto-injector subproduct in the EU market. I have an attachment here, which is just a PDF of the batch record. This is just a sample, of course, but that's just an example of a handy reference, if you want to get into more detail on an unusual trend in this plot here. And when you select a parameter, this parameter drop-down, you'll notice the whole process is outlined here, all the unit operations, phases, subphases, and so you can locate the parameters you're interested in. Some of these parameter names will be the same, of course, in multiple places in the process, but the whole context here is maintained throughout. And of course, the other beauty of this is as far as looking at this process flow here, that's part of the process definition. It's driven by that, and it doesn't require any IT to set this up and maintain and update it as new parameters are added or anything like that. I'll show you that in a little bit. So within this unit operation, I have navigation buttons. I can go from one to the next. Here's where we have a new target control limit. So I can drill right down into the target control limit information right here. So this one is effective from September 15th through the October 1st last year. That was the initial limit. That target limit changed, so I have a new target mean. I have a change reason. You can see who put in that new target control limit and who approved it. Mark approved it for me, it looks like. And this is where you can also put URLs, attachments. It might reference a CAPA system like a TrackWise that gives more detail on this particular process change. You could put in attachments that maybe you did some assumption testing in another tool, or you had to drop. It's another good place to capture the data set. What batches did you use to establish these limits? What ones did you exclude and why, and so on and so forth. The other thing is we implemented just recently really monitoring by exception. So the parameters, when they're configured in the process definition, you can set up the rules by which to check these points to see if it violated rule 1 point outside of 3 standard deviations, so many in a row increasing or decreasing, and so forth. When a data point is approved, a background process kicks off and determines whether or not it has any violations. And if we look at this point here, we can see this was January 6th, actually, when this point was approved, and it violated 2 Nelson rules, Rule 3, Rule 1, and that's the description. So that's actually getting back to the home page here. Like I said, it all happens in the background, but users, if they want to get email alerts whenever there's a rule violation or a point outside of a specification limit, they can go in here and select the product, and they'd only see the product they have access to, of course. They'd select the product and maybe a subset of the unit operations and say whether or not they want to get spec limit alerts or run rule violations. Any questions so far?
Nope.
So getting back to Analytics, just real briefly, there's process capability here. Well, before I get there, actually, I just want to show you in display options. This is where you can set up what rule set you want to use, what rules you want to check, and these are all configurable by a user with an admin role as far as what the rule set names are and what rule number is what. So it matches your SOPs on that. And then how you set up the limits, whether it's calculate from the data or using target limits. I use best options available, so if there are targets, you'll use those, otherwise they'll calculate from the data. But it will tell you whether or not there's targets are in use. What standard deviation method to use, short-term or long-term, which also known as Levy-Jennings. Whether or not to have a center line, data line, so on and so forth, whether or not to have a control and or warning limits. Specification limits, if you turn it on, you can select what limit you want to apply. These limit names are actually also configurable by a user with an admin role. We can display up to 3 in one chart, but it might not always be the same 3, so the rule names are user selectable here. So getting into process capability, we have 2 different fits here. One that uses short-term standard deviation, and which is basically the within here, and another one overall or long-term standard deviation. And you can select what spec limit to use to do these calculations. But in order to get CPK and so forth, you have to have actually you have to have spec limits, and I forget which one has them here. There's one. So it has a limits of 11 and 15, so I can calculate CPK and PPK. That's basically it there. Normality plot, and it applies. You can have 2 different test statistics to determine normality. Anderson, Darling, Shapiro, Welch. That gives you the test statistic values and the p-values that you can use to assess normality. And then, of course, we have a continuous line plot. So what, you do have cell expansion, and I'll do the last batches here. It will only show those parameters that are what we call continuous parameters, where basically every result and parameter has to have an associated timestamp. So I have an offline or offline samples table that was set up, and I could look at pH, for example. And so there's my pH for the last 10 batches. And there's PO2 and so forth. There's PCO2, and if I want to look at multiple parameters at one time for a given batch, I can select that. And then when I go into the parameter drop-down, I can choose more of these, BCD and glucose, for example. So it shows the last batch, and then I can show previous batches. So the whole idea is, it's pretty intuitive, easy to use here. It's just a matter of setting up what parameters are available, and then you putting in limits if they're available and entering batches. Here's the batch entry module. We have roles for that. So there's a batch data entry user role and data approver roles. So most people that use this in a validated environment use that. So one user can enter the data, and when they submit it, it becomes pending, and another user would then go and review and approve or reject the data and fix if needed.
One of the advantages that I would see with a system like this, if it was actually configured in online real time at our CMOs, is we do a lot of what we call virtual plant management. So we sit in Cambridge, and people all over the world are doing work on our behalf. It's hard to be there all the time. This would be a nice way to be able to follow along with either process development data or GMP data. So that's the advantage that I see to this kind of a monitoring system. I think what we would like to look a little bit more now is how do we build these monitoring systems, and how do we enter data in the event that it's not a pushed out of a Delta V or something like that? How do we get to sort of designing and building the software parameters.
Right. So then really it all comes back to this process definition, if you will. And this requires a special role we call parameter manager. So if a user has that parameter manager role and access to the product, that they build this out. And the beauty of it is it doesn't require IT skills. It's really a subject matter expert. And the amount of time it takes to create this is really dependent on the preparation that goes into it. And we recently worked with somebody that they provided a spreadsheet, and an Excel spreadsheet, and each tab was a unit operation, and then when you go into that, they had all the parameters listed and categorized by phase. So the phases could be, if it's a purification column, it looks something like this. We have load, wash, elute, it could be quill rate, whatever is appropriate. In production, I have some input, some culture data. I have a process and in-process control subphase in here. So this one here, it only has about 100 parameters. And something like this, if this is given to me all organized in a spreadsheet, it'd probably take me about an hour and a half tops to set this up. And once you get started, of course, there's copy and paste, right? So one unit operation is a lot like the next unit operation. Or load phase, you have these, wash phase, you have those parameters. So it's really quite quick. And just to give you an idea of what it would look like from scratch, so once you create a product, you go in here and there's no unit operations. So that subject matter expert would go in here and then they just start typing, this is unit op 1. And you can put in description, check whether or not subproducts or markets are applicable if they were defined for this particular product, which they have been. But you could add target limit categories. I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but this would be for situations where you have different control charts for the same parameter because it's different scales, right? You mentioned GMP and pre-GMP. They might be at different scales, so you could put that scale in here as a target limit category, and then you could break out the charts by scale, and you could have different targets per scale. But with a little bit of extra information here, it automatically generates the data entry forms for you. They might not look that elaborate or sophisticated, but that's because nobody has to develop them. It automatically comes out of this process definition. The only thing the user would have to do is say, okay, when they create a batch, do they have a date and time or just a date? If there's a time available, I always encourage use of that, especially if you can have multiple batches on the same day. Right. And then you can capture parent information. This is really for complex processes where they're splitting and pooling between unit operations. I'm not sure if that's the case with you guys, but you can capture the parent batches that went into each unit operation and the amount of each. We're providing more and more capability for visualizing that genealogy and doing upstream, downstream correlations. So I quit out of it, sorry. So unit op 1, and I just go with the default, and that's that simple. So that's unit op 1, and then I could add unit op 2, save, and then I could add a parameter. Let's say it's the start time. I select the parameter source by default. Their data entry limits only. It usually doesn't come into play. It's only for unique situations where companies want this to be a data source for limits, but not batch data. But we have derived where you can put in formulas and calculate things like step yield or growth rates, doubling time, that kind of thing. The durations come into play a lot, right? You put in a start time and an end time, and you want it to calculate the difference in hours or minutes.
Right.
Like the unit of measure, if it's a numeric parameter, but in this case I want to set this to a date time. You can associate a parameter class, and here's where you capture more context. Put in reference URLs, attachments, notes, which is really handy at a unit operation level to capture any major process changes. So there's a parameter. Pretty straightforward. Let's say you want to add a table. This is my expansion or cell growth sample data. And you say, well, it's a date time. I'm going to capture every sample I have a date and time. So it creates this table and add parameters like viable cell density, data entry parameter, the unit measure is into the 6 VCs per mil. And I want to have the users enter to 2 decimal places, and I expect it to be between 2 and 8. And if it doesn't match that, it'll flag it up as a warning, a potential data entry error. It would take the data though, and I'll enter viability. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how easy it is to set this up.
Yeah, no, it does for sure. Dan, any questions?
So if I went into batches here, it's already ready for batch entry mode. So I select the unit operation I want to create a batch for, submit. It pops me into the metadata where I can put in a start date or batch date time. It's going to be a required field before it's certainly approved. Here's where you could put in a copy of the batch record or what have you. I'll save this as a draft. So there's the start time parameter I put in there. And here's that table. So it's really a clickable link here. And it's kind of like Excel at this point. We have a status column because we, rather than approve and reject cell by cell when there's a lot of continuous data, we do it on a row by row basis. So you might enter all the data for one day and submit it, and somebody would approve that row, and then you can go next day and enter some more. But so it'll automatically put a status in here, but users just put this information in. And if I have the wrong number of decimal places, it'll tell me there. Viability 98%. So you could import data here as well. Import batch data starts with downloading a template. So up here, I could download the import template, and it'll put all the column headers in there with the unique identifiers, and just put the data in there and import it. By the way, I didn't mention, but in here, it automatically creates this query alias by concatenating the parent step names with the parameter names. So in this case, it's unit.op1.samples.dcd. And that is used for the headers in that Excel file where you can import batch data. It's used in the titles of your charts and so forth. And the other thing is, for those types of advanced analytics we don't currently have in the system, we provide external data access views where users can just set up a simple ODBC connection and set up a query to pull that data into JUMP or whatever report writing tool is of interest. And that would reference these unique query aliases that are automatically configured here. Any questions on the process definition before I real quickly look at limits?
Can you lock this down to where it's not changeable? Are other people editing your work?
Right. No, I mean it's we don't lock it down so it's never changeable because of course processes almost always change over time. However, we lock it down to user role. So I didn't get a chance to go in here, but here are the current users of the system. So Mark Isaacs, for example, we'll see what he can do. I could take away this parameter manager role from him so he cannot go in there and change anything in that process definition.
Yeah, but it's an interesting concept around data integrity, right? So what we will be looking for, we work in a regulated industry, is what is the risk that the information that gets put in there doesn't meet expectations, and then somebody goes in and changes the data. So there is a sort of and this is something that the FDA are very hot on right now, is this idea of data integrity. And so right. having the ability to change is not what we would be comfortable with, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's keeping certain people from changing it. Certainly you can't have it so that nobody can change it, but I think over time, at least from my experience, the process evolves, right? The process changes, or maybe somebody decides another parameter they didn't know was important is now important. They want to add it. I think it's all about control, and we have the role for that. And the other big thing about making changes, I think, is this traceability, this audit trail, and this is part of having a validatable 21 CFR Part 11 compliance solution. And everything I've done in here is audited. And I can see who did it and when they did it.
That makes it valuable. That's kind of what I was after, like whether it was.
Oh yeah, right. And it gets to be a lot of things that are audited over time, of course. So you can restrict it to a given user, a given product, and really know what happened and when. Exactly. The one thing we're going to add to this, though, that we're getting a lot of requests from our customers. When it comes to adding limit information, specification limits, or control limits, batch data, we do have this two-step process to the workflow where if approvals are turned on, which is a configuration option, approval required. We also have electronic signature option down here. But if approval required is yes, then whenever a new limit information batch is submitted, another user with an approver role would have to approve those before it's visible in the charts right now. But we're finding a lot of our customers would like to have that type of capability in this process definition. So it requires a second level of approval. When it comes to limits, looking at the time here, I want to go real quick. I'll switch over to Cambridge AMAB, where I do have a lot of limits. Not every parameter will have a limit, of course, but some do, some don't. This is where we started with the product because in all my years, I've never seen a product that's really focused on managing these limits and the evolution of these limits over time. And of course, what this product does is it automatically will marry it up with the batch data based on the date of the batch, the valid date range of the limit versions, and then based on market or subproduct or equipment ID or scale or whatever it is you use to define these limits. So some of these limits have more than, or some of these parameters have more than one limit. Here we have a release limit, an action limit, and an alert limit. We have a status column. Almost all these are current now. But there can only be one current version. There can be multiple obsolete versions. That's not turned on by default. But if I click on that, I can see viability has changed 3 times. It kept changing the limit. And what you can do, of course, is go in here and you can see the change reason. That was just the initial limit. This is demo data, so I didn't really do a good job of describing.
Everything was obsolete.
But I mean, the whole idea is you put in there the rationale, not only when did it change and who changed it, but why did it change anyway, or where did it come from in the first place? Is it a compendial limit? Is it based on the clinical experience? Is it based on the particular process, or what have you? And if it ever needs to change again, all you do is go in here and say add limit, and you just select a new valid date for that limit. You can put in a process target that can be used for process capability. Here's where you select your specification limit name, and you can add more than one here, of course, as well. And then you have less than or less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and trailing zeros are important here because they indicate the precision of the method. So like when you're doing a trending and you want to flag out of spec results, in this case it would round it to 1 decimal place because I have one trailing zero here after the decimal, and in 85.01 would actually, well, that would be, it has to be greater than that. That's fine. 84.9, 0.98, for example, would round to 85.0, so that wouldn't be a fail. But anyway, so then you put in the rationale, change reason, and so forth, and it would make this the current limit, automatically make the previous one obsolete, and flip the valid through date to the day before the current one. Yeah, it makes sure there's no overlapping date ranges, so you have ambiguous limit definitions. So there's a whole workflow to this.
So when you're changing your limits all the time, how does that impact your historical analytics?
Yeah, that's where it gets into, I don't know if I have an example of changing specification limits, but I do have the example of changing
To where it might
target.
tell you that it's not comparable or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, hold on here. Why? So this one here, for example, is where the limit changed. In this case, if it's a target control limit, if this is one version, right, so this was, it had this valid date range, so it was valid from September 15th through October 1st. This batch was on October 1st. The next batch was on October 2nd, which is when this one became valid. So it shifts the limit, and if it's specification limit, you'll see that step change in there as well. Does that make sense? So it'll plot the data against the limit that was in effect at the time.
Right. If we wanted to compare two batches side by side, is there an easy way for us to basically do a compare and contrast?
Two batches, from what perspective? I'm just trying to understand.
Diana just mentioned this question about whether two batches were comparable. If we wanted to pull up two batches and review the performance, is there a side-by-side comparator tool here where we could just pull up batch X and batch Y and look at a side-by-side spec report?
Or maybe pick up the parameters we wanted to compare.
Yeah, right, yeah. Is there a way you can do that?
The only way, side by side, of course, here each point is a different batch, but you're only looking at one parameter at a time here. And I guess what you're looking for is maybe looking at multiple parameters. I'm not sure. So in analytics, we saw the continuous line plots where you could overlay the last however many batches you want, 10, 20 batches, or just two, but for one parameter at a time there as well. One thing I didn't show you in batches, if there is something that is not in here that you'd really like to have, I mentioned the external data access. You can query it into another data source, but you can also, of course, just download it to an Excel file as well. That's certainly an option if you want to do another type of comparison, another package. I got to get the right date range in here. Just make sure I get a number of batches here. I'm only sharing the browser so you can't see it, so I'll have to stop sharing and share my whole screen. To open it up in Excel. So I guess this is one way. So I'm not sure what kind of a plot you would do to do the comparison.
Yeah.
So you can see for these parameters, and this is where the alias names comes in I was talking about earlier. So you can see from these two batches all the way down how they compare. I think one thing you might be asking about too, which I haven't come across for a while, I always wanted to put it in a product in my previous life that we worked on, and that was, what was it called? You basically select any number of parameters. You could do up to 10, 20, whatever, and that would be your x-axis is the parameter, and the y-axis, you just have a different line for each batch. So you could see how they go up and down across the different parameters. It was a neat visual to this, right? But we don't have that. I don't remember what that plot was called, but it's really neat.
Okay.
Anyway,
I wonder if you could do it with your sort and filter tool too. But
sort and filter for what then?
for your Excel file data, it doesn't matter.
Oh yeah. You can do that. Okay. Right. Yeah, the beauty of it is you can get this out and do whatever you want with it quite quickly as well. And that's our whole goal. And that file you saw I was just looking at the continuous or at the discrete parameters. But there's a table. There's another extra sheet in that Excel file for each table, whether it's continuous parameters or replicate. I didn't mention replicate, but that's another way where you can have multiple samples for the same batch for the same parameter. It could be multiple lots of a raw material, and you have, the osmolality or conductivity of each, or whatever it is. So that's another type of table. In the next release that we're currently working on, we have a raw materials module. So basically, you can create raw materials and treat them like a regular product, where you can create the process definition, add limits to the parameters, you can trend it, enter the data, so forth. But then you want to relate it to a batch, so we'll have the ability to add a raw material here. And then you select the raw material name, and it'll automatically ask you that you put a lot IDs and amount in the data entry area. And so ultimately, we'll have the ability to do this full upstream, downstream correlation. So we select a CQA, and then we can select process parameters or material attributes upstream to find out what might be driving that variability in the CQAs.